Right, so once we've taken the darts out, what we have to do is to close them with strips of lining. Just like we've done on this one, we're gonna close them and then zigzag over them to make sure that the edges are joined together. What we need is a strip of lining for each dart for the side that faces the fabric and also the inside. Now we have 4 darts in total, so that's going to be 4 on the inside, 4 on the outside, so 8 strips. Usually you can cut the strips out on the straight grain. I wouldn't recommend bias because there is just too much flexibility in the bias grain, and you don't want those edges to open up before you have zigzagged them. And chances are that if it is cut on the bias or you're using a bias strip, you just increase the chance for it to, for them to kind of like move apart. And so we want to minimize that risk. So I'm just going to cut out 8 strips. 4 of them are going to have edges turned in, and then we're going to continue on the machine. And make sure that you identify where the straight grain is, whether it's the cross grain or the length grain, and cut your strips out according to that grain. Now, they don't need to be wider than an inch. That's sufficient, so try to save some lining as well. All right, so we have 4 strips here. That's going to be on the side, that's going to face the fabric, and we have 4 strips here that will have their edges turned in. All we need to do is to bring the edge to the center of that strip, then run the iron over it, like so, and like so. And if you have a steam iron, then the steam iron is ideal for these moments, because the steam of the iron will make sure that the lining just stays where it is. So once you've done that, and you've done all of them, what you have to do is to make sure that there is no tension or room for shrinkage in the lining. And so once you've pressed it, make sure you turn it upside down. And if you have a steam iron, then that's going to work a lot better. Just wet it, allow it to react to the water, run your iron over it again, and that's going to make sure that all the tension is out of those fibers. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to soak your entire lining for every part, but because this is a sensitive area, it's the darts and the canvas of the jacket, the canvas is really going to be the skeleton. You don't want there to be distortions. You really want that to be as smooth as possible. Right, let's go to the machine. So before we machine the darts and we close them, I'd like to tell you something about closing darts. You can close darts in many ways. You can base them closed, you can fuse them closed, you can do whatever you want to try out. I believe that you have to be efficient in what you do and minimize the steps and make sure that the accuracy of your work is still up. So every time I close the darts, I bring this block and put it on the machine. So what that block does is that when I have this dart here and I put the block behind it, that's automatically going to help me if I push that into the block. It's going to help me to close the dart without there being any distortions like that or like that. You have to be very careful for that. So having a block behind it closes it exactly where it should be in its most natural form. And it doesn't also take too much time, as in like basting it. It doesn't make your work more accurate just because, let's say, you're pinning something or basting something. So that's why the block is there. Now, all we need to do is to mark where the apex or the tip of the dart is and make sure that we have that marked like that. And then take one of our strips, put that behind the canvas like so, and then machine one side and then bring the block forward like so, close the dart, machine the other side, and then trim the rest from the back and zigzag. So let's do that now. I usually start from one side just to keep things consistent, and that's the side on the front here. So I'll first machine that. And this is a part where your lining sometimes folds up, and then you do all your zigzag and you notice that your lining has been folding up. So always make sure that the lining is really flat and exactly as you want it to be behind the canvas. So that's that, like so. Align the straight grain with the cut. Start about a quarter or 5 millimeters above the apex of the dart. Put your needle in. Drop the foot. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go into this edge and make sure that we align the edge of our foot here with the edge of our cut. So it's going to go something like this. Like that. So we go from the center into the edge, and now the edge of the foot is aligned with the edge of the dart. And we also mark about 5 millimeters below the cut so that we know where to stop. So as we get close, we make that turn again and finish off into a point. Now, always when you want to do the second line, take your thread out and start over again. You don't want to do that in one go and go, in one machining line around, because you run the risk of making this, out of balance. So keep that in mind. Now, for the next line, I will use the block like so. Close this. Make sure it's not, pulling or whatever. And put the needle in. The same place where we started. Lift the needle up, bring the block as close as you can, and then bring those two edges together, and the block will assist you to lay them flat. Now, you have to push these two edges a little bit into each other to make sure that you definitely do not have a gap in between them. If you have a gap in between them, you're in trouble. So make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, again, what we're going to do is we're going to make a turn. So we're going to curve into this side and make sure that now the left side of the foot is aligned with the edge of the dart here. So it goes a little something like this. Make sure you push them together. And there you go. So now the edge of our foot, the side of our foot is in line with the edge of our cut. Now, you see what's happening here. This just wants to open up and go there. Make sure everything you do is without any tension. So allow this to just overlap. We're not going to do anything here. So let this just go so that the front section or the area that you're working on is completely flat without any pulling or strains. So then continue, and then like the other one, we curve into a point below the cut there. Okay? And that's it. Snip your thread. If we look from behind, we have this triangular shape that is sewn, and that's what's holding the darts closed. Now, the next thing we have to do is to do the same thing on this curved dart, and that's going to require us to be a bit more careful because there is a curve. And once we've done that, we're going to trim and then zigzag. Now, what's important with this curved dart is which one of these sides you do first. What's going to happen is that if you do the line on top first, let's say that as we're looking at it, this one is the longer line, and then that's the shorter line because that's the one underneath. If we would go around this first, we create a lot of surplus, and then machining this is going to push all of that into pleats. So what we're going to do is we're going to machine the bottom one first, because as we do that, that creates no surplus, and if anything, it creates this tension, which we then can use to close the top dart and then bring everything together without any issues on the machine. So we're always going to start with the one underneath, the shorter one. Same thing, we start from the tip, just 5 millimeters in front, and that's the center of the cut, so it's going to be really right up to that point. Make sure everything is free of tension. Move this aside. Place the center of this strip along with the edge, just like we did with the other dart, like so. Needle in. Now you can see we can curve this as we sew around, but you have to make sure that this, again, doesn't put a pleat or anything in there, because by the time you sew that to this edge, you have this big gap that can open up. So make sure you're careful. If you have too much shape, what you would do is you would first, if this is like really curved on a lady's jacket, what you would do is you would first machine this, make snips in those edges so that everything opens up and it can lay flat, then close your dart. So I'm going to show you how to do that on the other side. Okay, so again, we're going to go right into that edge and align the edge of the foot with the edge of the cut, and we're going to maneuver this into a curve as well. Now, if you just keep this taut and this as well, you just put your hands there. As the machine is sewing, these two are automatically going to curve into one another, like that. It just aligns itself automatically. So practice this. And when you get to here, because we have no padding, make sure that the domette doesn't move over. Make sure it's just covering the horsehair at all times. So, one line done, now we have to do the other line. Right, so now there isn't much tension on this. We can still lay this flat and get our work done. But what I meant was, if this was a lady's jacket and this was like really curved, and you know this lining was, you know, all the way lifting up like that, and every time you would put it flat, it would put just this crease in the middle. What you would do is to make a couple of snips. You can make one snip here, make one snip here, and make one snip here. And now this can just lay flat and it's not going to create a pleat. And then you machine this together, and then by the time you're done, this opens up and you're like, oh, now I've got this big gap. So that's how you can flatten it. And this is not going to affect the strength at all, because your snips are minimum, and you just have to make sure that they don't fold over as you're positioning. So again, block goes behind there. Bring the block close. You can see as I bring the block, it already positions things for me without me having to make any effort to say, oh, where should this be aligned? You know, is it like this, like that? The block will just bring this up, close this, and that's how it's done. So make sure there are no folds in your lining. Put your finger right on the tip of the dart. So start where you have to start. That's where the area that we marked. And then again, move the edge of your foot to the edge of the dart. Like so. And push these two edges together. But make sure you're not pushing the lining together. Just the edge of the canvas over into the other edge. Don't push the lining underneath, because that's going to create a gap. And as you sew, position things, make sure everything is laying flat, nothing is having tension. Now, as you're pushing them, you don't want them to overlap. You just want them to be very close to each other, as if they're going to overlap, but not quite. So, once we take that out, if we look from this side, you can see that we have a similar shape. Don't worry about this. This is all going to be inlay, so this is going to be trimmed. What you have to make sure is that you have enough coverage there. And you can see the snips don't even get into that lining area. So now, we want to do a zigzag. What we have to do first is to trim this back to 1/8 away from the edge of the machining. Now these surgical scissors are really handy for that. I mean, this is crap lining, and you're going to hear the sound of this crap lining as I'm trimming this away. But these scissors allow me to trim accurately along any kind of like lining, and it requires me to just close the blades and push them forward, and it gets very close without fraying. And it goes nicely around curves, and if it's a very nice lining, then you can do that in one motion, and then you get something like this, very close to the machine. You have to make sure your work is very fine. Don't leave big blobs and like zigzag, really wide strips. You want to make these strips make sure that the strips that you put there are not wider than 3/8 or 1 centimeter. Ideally, usually when I don't have a camera on my head, what I do is I machine them as narrow as to 1/4, so that there are no distortions around the chest area. But 3/8 is equally nice. If anything, it gives a little more strength, but there is very little difference in between them. It's just the aesthetics of them. So then we've done one side. Now you're going to do the other side. Something I want to point out when you're trimming lining in general, if you're in a workshop and the workshop it has, let's say, a slippery floor or is laminated, be very careful with lining. Lining is slippery, and if you step on lining, you can fall down. And this has happened to me a couple of times in the workshop, and it can turn very ugly. It's really very dangerous. So always make sure that if you are throwing your lining pieces on the floor, make sure you're throwing them in one corner, underneath your board, and then you're clearing it up as soon as you're done. Now we've done this canvas now, and the next thing that we have to do is to make sure that we zigzag it close and reinforce it, and then machine it from the inside to really seal this raw edge. When it comes to the zigzagging, like I said before, what you have to keep in mind is that the tension of your machine, the foot of your machine, shouldn't be too high, because if there is a lot of pressure on this foot, it doesn't allow the material to be pulled sideways. And so you end up pulling and distorting your garment. So all you want is that when you loosen this up and you put your finger underneath it and you let go of the foot isn't really putting a lot of pressure on your finger, and you'll feel it. Otherwise, it's going to hurt. So play around with that and practice zigzagging a couple of times. Now, how you're going to zigzag is like the following. Start from the straight one because that's the easier one. Then know where your marking is, and because our machining goes into a point, you have to zigzag small and then get bigger and bigger, and then gradually go to the other side and then go small again. So lift up the canvas like so, lift that up, and then make sure that this area that you're going to zigzag is flat and free of any tension. Just get the rest of this canvas out of the way. Drop the foot, drop the needle, and then all you're going to concentrate on is the fact that you're pulling your hand horizontally to the side with the same amount of pressure, and that your foot on the pedal is putting the same amount of pressure as well. So you don't go like, you just go in one motion. And this again, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Just count. The main thing is that you go one stitch over your machining to cover that raw edge that's on the outside of the machining. So it's going to be something like this. So by the time we look at the other side, you can see that the stitching is going more or less one stitch over the machining lines on the side, and that it holds that raw edge down. Now this side I could have done a bit more if I would get closer with my eyes to the machine, but at the moment it's not possible with the camera. So you can see that this is not really ideal. You want that stitching to go zigzag over the line and cover that raw edge of the lining. So it's good that it's visible now. We can look at it. So for example, this here is fine. This goes exactly, or this one, it goes right up to the edge. So 1 or 2 stitches over your sewing lines on the side should be enough. Now all I did was to focus on my hand going sideways. It looked as if I was going up and down with my hand, but I'm only pulling it sideways. It's the machine that's, pushing this backwards and forwards. And the rhythm of this reverse knob is going to be important, so that you get, consistent zigzagging and not like, like a weird heart attack pulse rate, So now we're going to do the curved one, and the curved one is exactly the same. It just has a curve, so it means we have to focus more on controlling this and make sure that you get very close to the foot and do it in sections. Don't try to do it from here to here in one, because this is going to be a diagonal line if you pull between this point and that point. You have to go up to there, stop, turn a little bit, then go, stop, and then go. So like this. You stop, you turn slightly, get close again. Align your cutting edge horizontally with the vertical foot, and then go again. Stop again, align. Okay, now we have something to evaluate here for a second. You see that this sometimes happens. Your domette in the areas where there is no padding is not held down. So sometimes this also happens here. You can see that slightly some parts of the domette are pulled back. This is very normal to happen. We try to prevent this from happening as much as we can. But I would say probably the most ideal way to prevent this is to use a machine whereby you actually have a zigzag function. So by the time you're putting this under the machine, you actually can close them down and don't need to do a zigzag like I'm doing on this machine. But since this is in the inlay area, this is all going to be trimmed away, and then the rest is going to get covered. Now, it's not a big issue, but if you have this roughness all along this line, then it's probably best to very carefully take the machining out and redo it. So again, if we look from this side, you can see that most stitches go over that sewing line and they hold down the raw edge at various points. Some of them are missing, but like I said, if you can get close and you can see what you're doing, then that's not a problem. Now, we're going to do the other one, and then we're going to machine the other side as well. So on this side, I started with the other one, with the other side of the cut edge. And when I reach this edge, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop and continue to the other side. And then we put the block again behind it, push the block right behind our work. Always make sure your work is free of any kind of pressure or tension. So now this sometimes will walk into the block if your block has a gap like mine, and you have to just straighten that out. But if your block doesn't have that, then that's fine. So then again, we curve into a point like this, and to complete that, we can now turn this around and go into our previous machining line. Like so. And so again, we have this strip with this triangular shape, and we're going to trim that later back. Now, again, we're going to start from the shorter line, the line that's, well, if you look at it from the front like that, we're going to start from the bottom line. Why? Because we don't want to create a surplus and then machine the other one despite of the surplus. We want to create a tension so that that remains smooth, and if it's too tight, well, we just make some snips into it. This is an area where you can say, oh yeah, but if you use a bias tape, you know, then it's going to be more flexible. I'm sure it will be, and I'm sure you can do that successfully. It's just that I would like to think that there is no chance of this strip stretching out in any way under the hands of anyone who may work with you or work for you, and yourself, especially when you're, you know, trying to maneuver so many things at the same time. It's difficult to keep track of everything. And another thing that I've forgotten to mention is that always start from the center and work your way outwards when it comes to darts. Don't start from the ends, because what's going to happen is, again, you're going to run the risk of, you know, displacing this. Or as long as you have the block behind it, that's going to put everything into position, and you don't need to really worry about much more. But if you don't do that and you don't have a block, you have to be guessing, you know, are they now aligned properly? Are they aligned, you know, correctly? And so now we have, again, this tension here, just a couple of snips to release that tension and allow it to lay flat. And that should be fine. Now, block behind it. The block will help to close the start, and off we go. So now we're going to just trim everything back and get ready for the zigzag. One thing that I do want to say is that when you're zigzagging, don't pull this flat. Always lift this up slightly against the foot as you're pulling sideways, because pulling this up is going to have the same effect as the block. And as you lift this up, that's going to close these two, or at least not allow them to separate from each other. Now, once again, as I rushed and I just pulled through it, what happened was the domette was pulled aside. Now, again, luckily, this is in the area that's going to be trimmed away. So the majority of this still has domette on top. Now we have to cover it with some lining to make sure that none of this has a chance of lifting up and sticking out. But if this would happen all the way along, especially on the tip, anywhere in this area, then we would have a serious problem. So I'm just demonstrating what can go wrong here. Right, so now that we have machined that, we're going to put the tension back to where it was, because we don't want this to be too loose. And you want the foot to grip the work. And the block can now go away. So as the block is out of our way, we now use our strips that have been folded over on the edges. And we're going to start machining those strips on along the edges. Make sure your work is free of tension. Place this on top of the work, like so. And then don't start from the very top. Start somewhere, halfway, right on the edge. You can see that this opening wants to move always. What you have to make sure is to keep this the front edge, the button area flat. Allow this to overlap for now, and then we'll get back to it later. So to cover this, we can do two things. We can either cut a straight line or cut into a triangular line, but make sure that it doesn't fall exactly on top of our previous triangle. So maybe you cut it slightly lower, so that it is layered, and the layering of those materials is going to cause a smooth transition. Now once you trim the sides, you can also trim what's underneath, so that now you only have one single layer and no folded edges on this tip, and cover the rest. And this one you can go just in one circle, because now everything is already secured and machined, so you don't need to worry about that. And then again, make sure you trim this where it should be slightly above where your previous lining was, so that when you trim this into a triangle or a square, it is layered and you don't have all the lining layers on top of each other, but slightly offset. So that goes out of the way. Then we lift this top layer off, like so, and we trim what's underneath right to that edge. And now we don't have double layers in that triangle. So now that can go smoothly into the point of the chest or the dart. So the idea is to have a strip that's folded in so that you have double lining right in the middle of where this raw edge is, so that if there is a chance of those horsehairs sticking out, you have two layers of lining covering it. Also, make sure that the starting points and the ending points are smooth, so when you run your finger over it, you don't have the tip of this lining on top of the tip of the other lining. You can see that my machining is slightly offset, which means that the edge where I'm at is not exactly on top of the edge of this lining. You can always do your first initial machining and the zigzag narrower, and then make your folded edge lining that's on the inside slightly wider. Work this out for yourself, because it's going to be confusing to explain this to you in a video and give you numbers. Just make sure that this is slightly wider than your machining and your lining on the other side, or vice versa. The main thing is that you end up with something that covers the horsehair and the domette right on the cut without being too thick. It should be thin and smooth, and it shouldn't be too rigid. Sometimes what people do, and I would say it's technically correct, it's just aesthetically not so nice, is that they would just have a single layer, or maybe, yeah, a single layer of lining or silicea put on top on the inside, and then instead of folding the edges in, they would just zigzag over this and over this at the same time. So they would first machine the darts closed on either side, then they would do the zigzag to go through everything. And that's equally as strong. It just, like I said, aesthetically it isn't that nice. It looks a bit, well, not so nice. In this case, when we get to the curved dart, as I said before, you have to start from the tip. Here we start from the edge, because we want to go from one edge to the point and then go back. And we don't need to worry anymore about this, offsetting, because it's already machined closed with a lining, and so now it's just turned into one. The main thing is that we still have to make sure that we start from the inside of the dart, or the underneath line, the bottom line, so that, again, as we go around, we don't create surpluses, because that's difficult to machine. It's always easier to machine something that's under tension than if it has a surplus. So start from the line underneath, the bottom line, the lower leg of the dart, as they call it. Place this there. And carefully maneuver this in a curve, and make sure that the center of your strip is always on the center of the cut. That's extremely important. Now, if there is some tension here, we're not going to make snips into this. What we want is to make sure that we really pull this tension over so that this sits there. And if anything, that tension will keep those two together, and it's not going to allow them to open up. So this is the tension that you can embrace, and it's not really harmful. Like you see, if I let go, it wants to go back. It bubbles up here. So I have to get my finger very close and make sure that it's flat at all times. Right, so let's evaluate this and have a look. So again, same principle here. We cover this. Now it's going to go into a curve. You can see there is, it's not really looking tidy around the tip. If this was something that I was making for myself or a customer, I would straight away take this out, redo this, and of course, without a camera on my head, without a camera on my head, I would really be able to see what I'm doing and get close to the work. So, like here, I've been missing just a small fraction, and there is this tiny gap now that doesn't have the machining, so I can put this inside there. That's not good. I mean, it's all right because it's just in the area of the inlay, so it's going to be trimmed away, but it's not good. I'm not going to say, oh, you get away with this or whatever. If it looks like this, which is like total crap, redo it and make sure it's neat. If it's for a customer. If you're just practicing, make a note of it, know that it's dodgy, know that you have to correct it, get into the habit of correcting it, and then make sure everything you do is neat. Of course, for the purpose of this video, I cannot redo everything that I'm doing. So all I'm showing you is the principle behind it and what it should be. Ideally, you want to have this triangular, you know, a neat looking triangle going all the way up to there and then up again without, you know, showing any of the zigzag on the sides or on the tip. So just keep that in mind, please. Okay, so once again, same thing. Starting from the middle somewhere, whether it's this side or that side, doesn't really matter. So for example, at this moment, there is so much tension on this that it doesn't want to lay down. You would think maybe something has gone wrong. Don't worry about that, because what you have to do is to force it flat onto your canvas, machine around, and then once you're done, trim the rest away after the canvassing, and that's going to hold it back. Now, compared to the other one, this one is slightly better. Again, the zigzag is showing through, which is not a big problem as long as the cut is covered, but it is a big problem if you're really fussy and, you know, you want to do things neat. So the idea, like I said, is for the lining to cover the entire area of zigzag and cut. So if your previous lining, which is on this side, is slightly narrower, your zigzag will be narrower, and then if this is this wide, it's going to cover that very nicely. But as long as you have a good line along the edge, both edges, this area seems to have a good line close to the edge, and make sure that that's neatly done and it's smooth, then you're good to go. This is something you have to practice and ideally do without getting disrupted. So let's just take this to the board and evaluate them. I want to do a quick recap and evaluation before I move on. Now, once you've done these canvases, the idea is that by the time you've done them, your lining and your zigzag is as neat as you can get it, and when you run your hands over it, you almost don't feel anything. It's as if you're going with your hands over the same layer without any disruptions or extra pieces added on top of it. The other thing is that once you do your canvas, as you hold it up and you allow it to hang, just look around from all possible angles, from the top, from the bottom, turn it around, and make sure that you look at the tip of the dart especially, and that you don't have any blips or distortions. Overall, your canvas should be as smooth as possible without any kind of like ripples or anything else. If that is the case and your panels are not misplaced or your cut hasn't been moved around too much, then you can continue. And like I said before, I wasn't sure if it was visible on the machine, but the idea is that you have one layer of material that's as thin but strong as possible, such as lining, on one side, which is going to face the cloth so that you don't feel any kind of like impression, and that you also have another layer on the inside, and that layer also is as thin as possible and again doesn't leave an impression, although it's going to get covered with pocket bags and all of that, but it should be neat. And one of the things that I want you to think about is don't expect the very first thing that you do to be neat. In fact, if you want to prevent becoming frustrated, as you will get frustrated, is tell yourself before you start to machine or you start to sew, I'm going to redo this 3 times at the very least. Because the difference between the good and the bad tailor is not only in, oh, do they know what they're doing, but it's also how many times do they redo. It's just like sports. You know, you watch the highlights of a sports game and you're like, oh, this person is, every time they show him, he's, you know, making a goal. But what you're not seeing is how many times that person has been shooting and has been missing. So don't think that if you don't get things perfect the first time, your work is rubbish. So for example, if I would evaluate and I would be like, okay, if this was for a customer, how would I think about this? I would think that this is a total disaster because first of all, the strip is not really running parallel. It's not a perfect strip, then here, like I showed you on the machine, you know, the lining is not long enough, and it should actually extend over this slightly so that it covers the zigzag. You know, it's not perfectly smooth around here. So I will see all of these things. And what I would do is I would make the decision to make sure that I would redo them if they do happen. I mean, obviously, when you're working and you're focused and you're not explaining things, or you don't have a camera on your head or whatever, then you can focus more and probably get better results. But if you're trying to kind of like, you know, distract yourself and you're doing multiple things at the same time, you will not have the ultimate focus, and therefore you are prone to making mistakes. So, like I said, make sure that your machining is very neat, close to the edge, and that it's covering the zigzag and your cuts. What you can do and what you should do is to make sure that either this side of your lining or this side of your lining is smaller than the other one, so that they don't end up exactly on the same point and therefore create a ridge. This is now about 3/8 thickness, because I did a foot's width either side of the cut. That's usually 5 millimeters, but you can also do that slightly narrower, but don't go too narrow. It should still be strong. You should be able to, you know, pull this apart without ripping it open, and that's why you do the zigzag. Now, another thing which you also have to keep in mind is that when you are doing a zigzag, the smaller the distance between your zigzags, like the denser your zigzag stitching is, the firmer that area is going to become. You don't want your canvas to be too firm in one area. So make sure that your canvas, your zigzag is at least, you know, widespread for about like 1/4 minimum. Don't go any closer. So if you would compare, for example, let me just get this. If you compare the distance between these points, it's about 1/4 to 3/8. 3/8 would be ideal. 1/4 is fine, but don't go any closer to 1/4, because then you're turning that part into wood. And you should maintain a level of strength but flexibility in that area. Having said that, this is what we would do as we close the darts. And now this shape that we have put into the canvases is going to stay there. There is nothing, if you have, let's say, a linen canvas, that is going to flatten this out unless, well, you intentionally completely flatten it out. But if you work along these shapes correctly, then this is not going to be flattened out easily. And if it is flattened out, the way you can detect that is by looking at your grain. So this is probably, if you pull, you know, along the dart, along the length grain, that's going to bring up the shape that you have put into the garment. And so when you put this shape, kind of like concentrate that in the middle, what you'll notice is that your grain is going in a straight line all the way up. Now, in case you flatten this out, watch what happens to the grain. Everything is pushed out, and when everything is pushed out, you can see a distortion in your grain. It goes from a straight line, then it bows out, and then it goes in again. That is a severe distortion, and sometimes it's inevitable and it should happen. But I will explain to you where that should happen. But if it isn't the case, for example, you've been working on this chest, and now, you know, you've pressed everything flat and you have your grain going like that, that's not really a good sign. You've just killed all that shape that's gone into there. And the same goes for the side. If it's bowing out too much, that means you're losing your shape. So you have to make sure that your grain, as much as possible, is always going along that vertical and horizontal axis, and try to remove as many distortions as possible. However, sometimes distortions are inevitable. For example, if you look at this point here, right at that point, you can see that the grain goes in and then it goes out again. Well, I wouldn't try to straighten that, because if I would pull, it doesn't matter how much I pull, it's still going to be a distortion there, because that's just a small blip right in that area. And when a jacket or a garment hangs from the body, it's being pulled by gravity. So it's anchored at one point, which is somewhere around the body, either the neck, the back neck, or the shoulders. But then the rest of the work is done by gravity, which is pulling this down. Now, gravity is only interested in pulling things down lengthwise. So it pulls from both ends. And if you start to pull things, horizontally, like for example, if you pull this forward like that to straighten this grain, and you do all you can to secure that in that position, there is a very big possibility that gravity is going to show you, its powers, and it's just going to pull this back. And as it pulls this back, all the length that you have been, all the grains that you have been correcting here are just going to go pop back, and then you end up with a lot of length there or somewhere else. So be conscious about that. Now, where we have to keep our eyes on the grain, I will explain to you. But that was a quick evaluation that I wanted to do, and some general information about the canvas from this point on, because I know that most of you wanted to know this, and so here we are. What's going to happen to this? This is simply going to be cross-stitched, and the reason why we cross-stitch this is that this is the area that's our suppression area. So on the forepart, and we're going to look at this later again, we have the exact same amount of length because of that dart that's taken out, but we don't have a cut there. So this has to resemble the same amount of length that we have on the forepart. If we would close this like so, and for example, put a pin in there, by the time we pick this up and we want to move this around the body, this could be shorter than the cloth, and therefore our surplus is just going to float on top of it, and it's not going to exactly match the canvas. Whereas if we cross stitch it, and I mean this is now open, but if we cross stitch it, when this goes around the body, this can open up slightly, but it's not going to be so left out open so that it can fold or curl back, as that sometimes does happen. And if that happens, then, well, it's very difficult to unfold a crease from the outside of the jacket. You literally then have to open up some part of the lining to get into there and to straighten that out. So the cross stitch is going to be done on top of this side, which is going to be facing the cloth. We start the top stitch always from the center, move sideways so that we don't create any blips or distortions. And we make sure that these two are kissing, these two edges are kissing like that as we do the cross stitch. But the cross stitch will allow these two to overlap if they need to, and to slightly open up if they have to. But it's not going to allow this to just float around in the open. I know that some tailors do this. I don't believe this to be technically correct or optimum, and therefore the cross stitch will solve that. Sometimes some tailors will put a layer of fusing here, or without the fusing, just zigzag, or do fusing and then zigzag on top of that. That can be correct, but the only thing wrong with that is that it now has zero tolerance for opening up if it has to. And you always want to keep this close, but you also want it to have some flexibility if it wants to open up or overlap. So a stitch like the cross stitch does that. As for now, I would say let's move on and continue with the canvassing stages.